Blessings, fellow weird and wild ones. My name's Goddess, aka G, aka your friendly neighborhood witch. They, them, their pronouns, please and thank you, point blank, period. Thank you for joining me in the practice of finding our way back to wholeness. This is our temple, our playground, our life, and our truths. During our audio session together, I will be talking with my village on how we are healing, changing paradigms, and decolonizing and degendering the mind. You are not alone. You are enough. Let's plant these divine seeds together. This work is for the collective from me, Brandon, Brenda, Kay, and Vesta. And there's a lot of magic that goes on behind the scenes. Find ways to support and reciprocate all the co-creators on the show at the links below. Grab your pens and paper, grab your woes, and let go. You can rest. Big Wind was born at the headwaters of the Missouri River to a northern Arapaho mother and gross ventre. Oh, wait, how do I say that?
Grovant.
Grovant. Okay, I'm gonna read.
It's French.
Grovant. Okay, is there any? Let me double check. Okay, I'm gonna redo that. Whew. Thank goodness for an editor. All right. Big Wind was born at the headwaters of the Missouri River to a northern Arapaho mother and Grovant father in Great Falls, Montana. Big Wind was raised on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming and enjoys being outdoors, hiking, and swimming in the nearest waterway. As an Indigenous two-spirit, they believe in the art of balancing both masculine and feminine energies and how tapping into that power can lead to a more balanced approach to accountability and transformative justice. Yay! Thank you, Big Wind, for being here this morning.
So glad to be.
Yeah. I love it when we share space together because I always feel like what you have to say is so profound and like really gets me back into my body and knowing myself. So I'm glad that other people will be able to share in those like treasures that you bring. So thank you.
Oh, likewise.
Like, oh, shucks. Okay, so this is the part where we just reshare our pronouns and name and the race and ethnicity we embody so people know where we're coming from. So I can start. My name's Goddess. I use they, them, their pronouns exclusively, and I am Black. How about you?
I'm going to introduce myself in my native tongue, Ahinan Aethit, and Hithitin na Habethan, Hasisbe na Asitna, Hinan Inina, na Hate Nichi Hehe. Hello, my name is Big Wind. My Rapo name is Hasisbe, which means old man's son. And I use they, them pronouns exclusively as well. And I'm Indigenous to North America.
Thank you. I appreciate that, the introduction. And then our check-in question is, in this moment, what community members are you carrying into this conversation with you?
Yeah, I feel like in this moment, I want to bring in like my grandmother Rosemary and the other matriarchs from my lineage that remind me of a time before police and before us relying on a Western world to like hold people accountable for their actions. Also, I want to, carry many mentors into this space. One of them being the late Eddie Wada, who's been gone for quite some time now, but as a child taught me, how to organize and like early practices of accountability in movement spaces and at the tender age of 13. Really appreciate them and want to bring them and their skill set into this space as well.
It sounds like you've had throughout the years, people like even from a young age, and I don't know if all of us have had that, so blatantly so of like people who have taught you how to practice like community care and accountability in ways that are like truly healthy and um allow for people to like be themselves, and that's freaking powerful. um and then for me, I'm bringing into this space um loved ones that I'm learning um how to hold accountable for their whiteness,
Mm,
how to hold accountable for their anti-blackness. I'm bringing myself into this space for um, anti-blackness within myself. And I'm also bringing into this space people who I consider elders and teachers. Um, my friend Rainbow, who um, continues to remind those around them of their enoughness. Um,
mm,
Sarah, Allison, ooh, Brandon, Brenda. There's people in my life who we are continue to fumble toward wholeness within ourselves and within seeing that mirrored back in our community. And I'm really blessed to have people who want to go there with me.
mm,
And those that don't, I'm learning how to discern them and go from there. So this is part of that
yeah.
conversation.
Yes.
So this episode is actually based off of conversations that me and Big Win have had in the past. And in one of them, you described affinity groups or community as a living entity created from all the intentions of the beings who put it together. Can you speak more to this? Because the way you put it was just spot on.
Yeah, of course. And I think um when talking about, accountability and restorative justice, like I feel like we have to acknowledge that right now we're at like this preposition time where no one really knows how to hold each other accountable. And I
Mhm.
feel like we've become dependent on these systems put in place to have accountability in our circles and in our communities. And I feel like there's something wrong with that notion that we shouldn't hold each other accountable. It leaves a lot of room for people to never be held accountable for their actions. And, if they are held accountable, it's like through the criminal justice system, which is, inherently classist and racist to begin with, But, Hinana A, uh, which means blue sky, like the blue sky, our people, in our sacred language, Hinana A, like there are things that once they're created, they take on their own lives. They become animate objects in our language. And I feel like language is so important and it creates your world perspective. It creates the values around you, and language is so important, and being able to like grow up with that. Um, I feel like we learned that a lot of things for us in our life that we consider living things, but in English they're not animate, and English definitely takes the sacredness out of a lot of things. And so when we're like creating something, it becomes alive. It becomes its own identity with its own culture and dynamic of its own. Um, and I feel like that's definitely where Western and Indigenous ideologies collide. Like, how can you make a belt, or how can you make or a bustle, and then it becomes alive? Well, I feel like it happens on like intention at its purest form, and our belief, like humans' belief in something, is the most powerful tool that we have in our toolkit. And when we believe in something, anything becomes possible. So when creating an organization or an affinity group or a similar structure, we're creating a being that takes on its own life. And that's why we have to be like careful and mindful and intentional when we are creating these groups, because I feel like that also in turn is why many fail. They fail to see the spiritual side that's created when creating this entity, the energy that's being created. And it becomes a machine of its own, and then the ideas either take off from the people or the people take off from the ideas, and then it becomes an amoeba of some sort, that just continually exists. And I feel like, especially when people are on the same frequency about what they want, their goals, their needs, like you can create really powerful structures and entities. But if, in that space, it's not held properly and that structure isn't sustainable or balanced, it tends to fall apart.
Yeah. I see this a lot when because when we're forming these organizations, as you spoke before we even started this podcast about like we're coming from different perspectives, different viewpoints, but we have like we might have the same intentions. Sometimes we don't, and I think it's important to be discerning and ask the right questions so that you are working with people that have the same intentions as you do. But we're all coming from these different ideas, and a lot of these ideas, and even in ways we don't know, are really rooted in whiteness and in white structures of power. And so we bring these into these organizational spaces. And so something that we came to for a sense of belonging, and longing to be cared for, and to be fully seen, now become, like you were saying, like really robotic and transactionary in a very cold and lifeless way. And so we have these very living, breathing beings who feel all these feelings operating from this mechanical sense, like operation, like way of being. And it's not natural. And so there becomes like, there's all this discord that happens. And so to look at it, like you were saying, as this like living entity that needs to be, I see as like needing to be cared for and nourished, and like also fully seen as well, I think takes on a different nuance of how we approach things within organizations and just groups in general, relationships, that often gets missed. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So with that being said, like what has been some of your experiences or noticings, like how has repair been attempted in the past, and what patterns do you see in how you navigate these situations?
Yeah, I feel like you were saying, white culture is just very pervasive, and it's penetrated like all forms, like everything. And so I feel like a lot of the dominant culture is based off of, how essentially white people have interacted for a long time. And I feel like it definitely, goes back to like a patriarchal, and like you're talking like a very logic based taking, when creating an organization. And I feel like that's definitely a part of the culture that I've seen, that a lot of especially masculine people don't want to be held accountable, and become very defensive, like in a lot of situations. And I feel like it's hard, especially like when talking about a smaller setting, like an AG, for instance. The first thing that people don't want to admit is that they're going to have, like, there's going to be conflicts. And I feel like addressing it head on from the beginning and being like, hey, like, there's going to be times when we're going to bump heads and we're not going to agree with each other, but how we handle it with each other is like going to affect the culture dynamics of how other people will interact within this, organization, because it creates a culture. I feel like a lot of there can be a lot of like hurt, because as a larger society, we avoid conflict. And then in turn, we avoid accountability. And this neglects the society role of accountability because we rely on, different systems that find accountability for us. But then how can we ask for it? And how can we address it? And how can we create this healthy dynamic inside our organizations that address accountability head on?
Yeah. To go along with what you were saying, I find that it's not when I step into an AG, which I had to ask. Big one with us was in our last company, an affinity group.
Right.
When I step into an AG or any type of organizer, or even a like relationship of whatever form that takes, I get really excited. I'm like, oh, I'm here. Like, people are excited to be around me, and that feels really good. And I don't like start to ask like the hard questions and like being really realistic about like, okay, what protocols do we have in place with this group before we start diving into things where that will help us hold space for conflicts, because they're going to happen. I think we think that like those things aren't going to happen, or our love is just going to be so great that they like, we'll get through it. And yes, you can get through it, but through planning ahead and like thinking about things and being realistic. Because like you were saying, we are coming into all of these organizing right now. There is just waves of organizing going on. Not that they were before, but there's like this white urgency. And so all these like demands of white organization from BIPOC organizations that are poorly resourced to like spring up and do this great work, to combat racism, which it shouldn't be our job in the first place. And when conflicts come around, we're asked to be logical. Like we feel like we need to be logical and remove our emotions from it. And that's very rooted in like this disconnect from body that we learn through trauma, which goes back to genocide, to enslavement, to so many ways in which we were told that our bodies were unsafe. So when we step into those spaces, I notice that I, for one, forget that needs to be there, of like, oh wait, I have questions. I want to know what we can do and what your ideas around communication are in times of like tension, so that I can fully show up for you and I can fully show up for myself. So yeah, I definitely vibe with you on that one. Definitely.
For sure. I feel like it's really hard because at the end of the day, like English is a foreign language to us. And essentially when we're dealing with, situations or like the dominant culture that we're often excluded of, like it creates this dynamic where I feel like nonviolent communication is expected, but it's also a privilege, because when you have people who are from primarily European descent, then I feel like that's definitely a big part. Like, this is your language and you can use it as a weapon against me because I don't know enough, or that you perceive I don't know enough. So like talking about, access to those, circles, access to like that type of information, and even access to like nonviolent communication. I feel like we all have different communication styles. We're all learning from each other. But it also all goes back to, even when we were young, like how were we punished when we did things wrong as a kid? And how were we rewarded when we did things good? And that goes into probably a whole different discussion of like the domestication of humans, which many of us don't want to talk about.
Let's say that for another episode. I'm so down. I'm so down. Yeah. Ooh. Yeah. With language, you are right. Like it's not, even for us who grew up in the US, it's not even just about like, yeah, it's not ours. And there's more than just the words. Like it's the meaning behind the words, and it's the energy, like you were saying, that goes into them. And I think when you were saying that, what came to mind is that like people who are European or white have been doing the white thing for far longer than we have.
Yes.
And we were forced into it.
Yes.
And they were forcing themselves into it, and other people that look like them into it far sooner than when we were. And I think there's this complete uprooting of self that happened so long ago for them. And for us, it's not as unrooted. And so when we feel like something's not right about this dynamic, something doesn't, I feel like I'm being slighted. Like, like we're gaslighted by them. They're like, oh, you're not feeling that. Maybe you need to let me play devil's advocate, this, that, and the other, because they're so used to being out of their body. It's generation after generation after generation.
Right.
And for us, it's there too. It just happens so much sooner. I mean, not sooner, but like later. And I think there's something there to that. I think there's something there. And I'm also very grateful that it hasn't like completely happened to us. Happened to us yet. Yeah, absolutely. So this is kind of like a question we're covering, but also deeply about ourselves and our own ways of navigating repair. So like, how has whiteness played or not played a role in your own practices?
Well, I have a European grandfather, and I feel like I believe, as a light complected native, it's a part of me, and it's the alchemy of my flesh, I growing up on the reservation, I feel like, on my mother's side, so my life and like my worldview being shaped by being a Arapaho person, and the teachings in our ways. And so like for a long time, I feel like me personally having like this internal battle with multi-ethnicity, and it like whiteness has affected me and given me privilege that I didn't really realize until I was an adult, and like being off the reservation and away from my community. And so I feel like owning that and trying to use that to benefit for my people is like what I can do. And that doesn't negate like how invasive whiteness is, because whiteness is hella invasive. Like when we're talking about like the dominant culture, like it's tainted even like our spiritual practices. It wasn't even until 1978 when like the Native American Religious Freedom Act was passed. And so I feel like it's pervasive enough that it has gotten into our spiritual practices and gotten into, certain ways that we do things. And, you can call it tradition. And like, no, this was started because of colonization, and things like that. And so I try to think about that and really trying to work on that internal, part of myself. I feel like that internal component of myself of feeling distant from whiteness, but also like being white and being indigenous. And just I feel like for me, like I definitely can fall into ambiguous type situation. Like people know I'm mixed, and so that's definitely a big thing. I definitely feel like it's I don't know what I'm trying to say.
It's okay. Maybe it'll come back, or just take your time. We're listening. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I just feel like there are a lot of people in this country that have mixed ancestry, right? And so then we're put into this other category. And then for me, what does it mean for me as like a light complected person who has a certain amount of privilege, but also is connected to their culture and their language? Now, for me, I feel like a lot of people, and especially white people, would be like, why don't you just like accept whiteness and fucking just shut up already? And like, to me, that's assimilation, and I don't want that. And I know that I might not look like exactly what my ancestors looked like 150 years ago, but nor do I expect my descendants to look exactly like me in 150 years.
Mm.
But that does not make all of us Arapaho. We're all Arapaho. We're always going to be here.
I had to sit with that. That was a game changer thing you just said. Woo. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Whew. For me, whiteness has been something that I've strived to attain. And it was idea. Like it wasn't told to me like, ooh, you need to act like a white person, but basically you need to be a respectable young lady. And that equates to being like well, mannered white woman. And so I experienced separation as well from like through being raised in a cult where it was the intention to not only be separated from Blackness, but separated from anything that was outside of the cult. And the cult was a very white cult.
Mm-hmm.
And was very anti-Black. It's based in anti-Blackness. And then even within my education, I went to advanced placement schools and was reared to be this very white idea of what an intelligent person, a very articulate person, should be. And so when I got out of my house, I found that when it came to conflicts, when it came to moments in which I felt like I had to prove myself, I always felt I had to prove myself through intellectualizing things, and I always had to have a book learned or like very wordy comeback or something to say to prove that I was hurting, to prove that I had been harmed. And so when I didn't have that, I just stayed silent. And I went into myself, and so then I became just very removed, and so in situations of conflict, I would just like leave my body, and I'm still working on like what that meant. Not only harm to my spirit body connection, and but the terror that continued to be, it kept going in relationships, moments when I could have showed up, or And also I found that when it came to defending others, I would use fight mode. Like I would be ready to fight for them. But when it came to myself, it wasn't that same thing. And I think that goes back to seeing my own trauma playing out with someone else and being like, oh, hell no. And this little person in me is just like, let knock if you bug, like, let's go, let's do this.
Right.
And so there's just this like drastic difference. And I see that in how I approach things now as like the ways in which I'm starting to listen to that little person more. And so you're seeing a lot more of me saying how I feel. But there's also learning how to express my anger without, you talked about this on Facebook once. It was, what is it? Horizontal harm?
Lateral oppression.
Yeah, lateral oppression.
Lateral violence.
Lateral violence. I don't also want to do that of like, especially as I come into more spaces with people who are also BIPOC, because I for the longest time around a whole bunch of white people. How do I come fully myself and ready to protect myself, and fully be seen and vulnerable, and open to correction or repair, or to be calling out, while not practicing that lateral damage. And I think sometimes that's just going to happen, and you have to be ready for what those consequences might entail.
Right.
Yeah. I think I went on like a whole freaking tangent, but
for sure, it was worth it.
Thank you. I feel like we're noticing a lot more these days, about ourselves and just about the environments that we are in, whether we're forced to be in them or we choose to.
For sure. I feel like as like a kid, like, or as a young person, like a lot of the situations, I don't know, both are enrolled members, and then my dad's dad, he's white. And so just kind of like in that situation, how are we like in those situations, like finding ways of like that whiteness, you know what I mean? Outside of like that dominant culture, because whatever the dominant culture, it's very punitive when trying to find like repair work. It's all about trying to punish people and all about fear mongering, and all of those things, they're not really good teaching tactics. Like they don't teach kids well, like when those things are utilized against children. And so why do they work on humans? I don't think that there's like a straight answer. I think, I think it's definitely, we're having these like the mingling of cultures where like, a big part of, how we handled community care, how we handled accountability, how we handled, when somebody does somebody wrong is completely different from like the very systems that have been put in place that are supposed to like find the accountability for us, right? And I feel like it leaves a lot of people powerless from that situation.
The systems that are meant to find the accountability for us. I'm thinking about like the court system, investigative tactics that, police use, all of those things. You're right, they feel very removed from actually listening to ourselves. And they're based on trying to prove someone guilty of something so that they can be punished. Yeah. Yeah.
And we
So,
and we mimic that within our own groups, even
mm,
within our own containers. We mimic because we've seen exactly what happens in society. And that's the hard thing is like, especially when joining, you know, white-led organizations or joining organizations that are majority white, you have this dominant culture that is very punitive and that is based on how they handle things is based off of that dominant culture. And so when we're talking about a culture shift, recreating, spaces that are centered around BIPOC voices, we have to really think about, you know, a totally different strategy about how we hold each other accountable, not only between allies and, BIPOC people, but internally as well. I'm talking about, this lateral oppression that happens.
mm,
Like, we have to figure out different systems in place that are devoid from that dominant culture if we want these organisms to exist, to continue to thrive.
yeah. So, what methods have you found outside of whiteness?
um I feel like my mom, she's a very strong rapper woman, and she was basically like a single mom, like uh, raised us a lot, and I feel like she taught us a lot of things, and I was just raised by just really strong Indigenous women. And my great grandma, she's still alive. She's 98, and she's the oldest living Arapaho right now. And the way that I feel like femmes not only take on like a caretaking role, but the energy itself is just different than this like mainstream punitive thing. And I feel like the way that I've seen a lot of things play out, when I was out at Standing Rock, we had security, right? And security helped with a lot of functions about trying to keep this, camp good, right? There's multiple camps. And so when we would have a problem, our issue was not to police these people because that's not who we are as a people. There is going to be conflict. We need to figure out both sides of the story, or how many different perspectives there are of the story, and then have this council of femmes like figure out the situation. And this dealt with like sexual assault, with fights, all of these things would happen because that's what happens in society. This like very the ugly parts of our society that we don't want to admit. How do we handle those without police? How do we handle those things without uh, social workers? You know what I mean? And how do we not just push it off on somebody else, like kick them out of the community so they can go harm somebody else, not in your community anymore?
Mm,
It's hard, but I feel like as Indigenous people, like we hold on to teachings that have kept us here for, and continuously keep us here. And I feel like that's we have to remind ourselves of like that relationship, and um, really dig into something more restorative and looking, at that situation. I feel like for a long time, like, yeah, I would end up in situations where I was, working security and, you know, there would be families, or whatever, having a dispute. And most of the time, it was just people reacting to their traumas, you know? And we're all hurt and we all have baggage and we all are carrying on things and we bring things into these spaces. And to think that we've left everything at the door is just naive. So you talk to people, you know, getting people away from each other, calm down so that they can, you know, tell the situation. Then you're like, oh, well, okay, like this isn't, most of the time, it's not as bad as it, you know, as it is. But it's really hard when things can just go from like 0 to 100. Obviously, like people's emotions are going to start dictating, you know, what they do. And so when we're talking about restorative, you know, justice, like how are we going to hold these people accountable? But then how are we like still taking care of what the victim needs or like what the survivor needs, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like you were saying, like this is like very complex because there isn't a lot, like there isn't an abundance of these things being practiced. Like we weren't always raised to like use these practices. And so our default are these punitive systems. And so this was a hard question for me because I feel like I'm still in like the infant stages of this and like gathering resources. But I will say that I've actually learned a lot from I feel like Rev Angel and Lamarad Owens have taught me a lot about how to presence myself so that I'm not leaving my body and resorting to my like flight, fight, freeze mode, so that I can fully look at the situation. Yeah, like you were saying, like in the heat of the moment, it's all of the things right away, and it builds and builds. And so being able to go into that state right away, at least it allows me to look at the full picture, or at least more of the full picture, or start inquiring into what the full picture is.
Right.
Yeah. And also starting, I think just with like work through therapy, and through, really investing in, wholehearted relationships with other people, friendships, family members, romantic partners. I feel like I take that into organizing with me. And learning how to make space for it's not always so black and white. There's not always this one person is just the victim, this one person is just the perpetrator.
Right.
And that's been really hard. And I think that's where the complexity lies. It's like, okay, so if we're not just the victim or not just the perpetrator, then again, we're not going to this punitive way of handling it. We're not going to be like, okay, we punish you, and we either ignore the other person and they got to go figure out how to heal on their own, or we just nurture you. Like, what happens after the fact? Like, these people are still living and going on. And so how do we hold space for both? And I don't have the answers, but I did want to give a list of some of the things that have been recommended to me, and I can't wait to crack open once I finish the books I'm currently on. But so the revolution starts at home, confronting intimate violence. Oh, you read it? Okay. So, yeah. Okay, good. So confronting intimate violence within activist communities, by Ching-In Chen. Jai Delaney and Leah Lakshmi Pepsna I struggle with their last name, Samarasinha, and I should practice saying that. But I'm also reading Leah's book, Care Work, and that has been teaching me a lot, and encouraged me to ask some hard questions. And then also there's where did it go? Fumbling Towards Repair.
That's a really good one too.
Oh, I cannot wait to read this book. Rainbow
so
is
good.
Regain. I'm like, yes, Fumbling Toward Repair workbook by for community accountability facilitators by Miriam Kaba and Shira Hassan.
Mm-hmm.
And then How We Show Up, Reclaiming Family, Friendship, and Community by Mia Birdsong is another one. Yeah. There's a really good podcast with her and I forgot their name. I'll put it in the links. But talking about the book and just her own personal experiences, and they're both Black-bodied individuals, and just talking about how we've been kind of raised to be very individualistic and to survive on our own, and how that leads to a lot of isolation. Yeah, a lot of isolation. And then the Creative Interventions Toolkit, and that's online, and I'll also do a link to those. But these are all things that I have found through people of color, and created by people of color, and that's where I want to be with where I'm resourcing these tools.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of people are starting to look within the circles that I am in, the communities that I am. I don't want to call them circles; that feels weird. So yeah, this is a continued journey, definitely a continued journey.
Right.
So how do you dream repair will look in the future?
Yeah, and I feel like that's the biggest thing, is that we have our the beautiful thing about it is that we have the ability to dream whatever we want, right? I feel like one of the biggest, largest things that I can see affects repair work is hierarchical structure. And this is a part of the larger systems that we've put in place. And so then people have their jobs within the society. And so then, there are people who handle repair work, things like that. When we take back our power, we have to acknowledge that we're both the oppressed and the oppressor at the same time, that we play both roles, and that we all exhibit toxic behavior, especially within group settings, because of this dominant structure. And the hardest thing is when you have a hierarchical structure, you rarely have people at the top held accountable. Well, the people at the top are always demanding punitive actions against the people below them. And so when I think about the future, and how we're re-envisioning organizations and groups and AGs of really thinking about how we can make non-hierarchical, if we want something that is more like a cooperative, then we can all hold each other accountable. We're not waiting for somebody with a title to do it. And I feel like the biggest part of, when talking about repair work or accountability, we really have to look at, how we're navigating the abusive habits that we perpetrate in these communities, that we do inside of our own circles. And for me, I want to be a great leader. And I want to be a great leader because I have always been a person that helps people. Like, that's been my role. And, as a two-spirit person, like, it's always been our role to like address conflict and mitigate those situations. And so I try to find myself, as a person who embodies both masculine and feminine. I feel like we possess a power that allows us to see a wider perspective. And so, in that perspective, like, how do we utilize that? I feel like that a lot of people, one thing that I do see changing though is like a lot of people in our generation are, and maybe a little bit, I mean, younger and a little bit older, have been really accessing or trying to access like mental health services, where versus like for a long time it was just like one of those things like that nobody ever talked about and then nobody ever did because they didn't want to be seen as like the nut job or whatever. We're all things uh, from our history, our personal history, and then our collective history from our DNA. And so to be able to address those things, I feel like also makes an amazing difference because people know what actually are going on within themselves to be able to like pinpoint that and be like, oh, maybe I was just, reacting that way because of a traumatic experience when I was younger and it triggered me. Versus like that has never been like a thing of the past. It's like something that we're working into, which I feel like is really good. And when talking about the future, like it's about us like having open, honest, unwavering honesty with each other, being vulnerable with each other. And, I feel like those things are what are going to lead us to a more transformational, more repair work that's rooted in interpersonal communication, and then how we're addressing conflict without just creating more violence.
Yeah. Yeah. I imagine it to be like that too. And I imagine it to be a lot less secretive because there should be no shame in messing up, but there should be remorse and accountability. I feel like instead of like these private hearings and things of that nature, like it is a council of people that come together and like communities come together to talk about what happened and to hear the stories of the people who are involved. And I found myself when I said people, I almost said parties, and I'm like, that's so dehumanizing to call these beings with feelings and experiences just parties, But and to be able to lean into other community members, like caring for us in all the ways we are hurt and to be able to do the same for them. For instance, when my mom, when her mental health was too much for her to be able to be a mother in that time, I would go over to my grandmother's or someone within, the religious cult that I was in to be with them because she knew that she couldn't be a mother right then. That was her being a mother, was asking for help actually. And like how can we apply that to when harm is done? Like who can we go to talk about it and be like, I need your insight. May I have your insight, and it being like across generations,
Mm-hmm.
children seeing these practices openly, elders being a part of the conversation and going to them, and valuing the knowledge, the wisdom that everyone has in those situations. And like, that's the biggest thing that I think comes to mind when I imagine what repair will look like. Yeah. And so as we're dreaming of what repair can look like, and manifesting that through our own practices, can you tell us like what you're currently doing with your own work? Tell us a little bit more about what you're up to.
Currently, well, I feel like a big emphasis on my life right now is just movement work, and I am a water protector. And so my passion, my drive, everything, it comes from the earth. And so it feels like it's my duty, to protect her. And so for right now, I've just been going to resistance camps that are fighting the fossil fuel industries, and, when we're creating these resistance camps, we're creating communities that don't have police and that don't have a lot of the systems that have been put in place. So it gives us a lot of the imagination that we need to be able to create these things. And I feel like when talking about relationships or in movements in general, like, to create anything sustainable is all about creating and how we're being in good relations with each other, and how we're being good relatives with not only the earth but with each other. And so, when creating, relationships, healthy long-term, like reciprocal relationships, I think it's important, and I feel like relation building is central to making movements in mutual aid work. And so I've definitely had my experience with repair work through the movement, and like, how are we envisioning, this new world within our current spaces. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing what you've been up to, and all of what you've expressed throughout the session together. Again, I feel like when we talk, it's a mirror to my own heart and my own intention. And I feel like often your words remind me of like that it's okay to thaw out, that it's okay to hold compassion and love. And I deeply, deeply appreciate that. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. I hope we can do this again. That's it, y'all. That's our show. Big thank you to Black Dream Escape for providing us with the intro and outro music for season 2. We sincerely love your work and hope rest comes to us all. And big thank you to Vesta for producing our small but mighty podcast. This show is powered by the people. May the abundance come back to you and spread like wildfire. Sunseed Community is a space to practice collective healing. We do this through workshops, body and energy work, tarot, individual container building, and this podcast. To learn more, book us, and support us, Visit sunseedcommunity.com and follow us on IG or Facebook at Sunseed Community. Bye, y'all.
Rest will come. Rest will come. Rest will come. Rest will come.